Grandma, don't sign anything tonight, my grandson Marcus whispered urgently in my ear as the lawyer spread documents across my dining table. I thought he was being dramatic, but when I discovered what those papers really contained, I realized my own family had been planning to steal everything I'd worked 70 years to build. The action I took next left them all speechless. Follow my story to the end and comment the first letter of your name so I can see how many of you stayed with me through this shocking journey. I'm Dorothy Kellerman, and at 70 years old, I never imagined I'd be sharing a story like this with complete strangers. But sometimes the most important lessons come from the most painful experiences. And maybe my story can prevent someone else from making the same mistakes I did. Let me take you back to how my life looked before everything fell apart. I live in Millbrook Heights, a quiet suburban community nestled between rolling hills about 45 minutes northwest of Chicago. My house sits proudly on Elmwood Drive, a tree-lined street where massive oak trees create a natural canopy that turns brilliant gold every October. It's the kind of neighborhood where people still know each other's names, where children ride bikes safely on sidewalks, and where the biggest excitement is usually someone's new flower garden or a minor dispute about property lines. My home is a modest two-story colonial with cheerful blue shutters and a wraparound porch that my late husband Theodore insisted on adding in 1983. We bought this house in 1978 for $42,000, which seemed like an astronomical sum on Theodore's high school mathematics teacher salary and my part-time bookkeeping income at Henderson's hardware store. I remember standing in the empty living room on moving day, overwhelmed by the mortgage payments we'd committed to, wondering if we'd bitten off more than we could chew. Theodore just smiled and said, "Dorothy, we're not just buying a house, we're building a foundation for our family's future." How right he was. This house has weathered 45 years of our lives together. The hardwood floors bear the scuff marks from 3 children learning to ride bikes indoors during harsh winters. The kitchen walls display layers of family photos spanning decades. School pictures, graduation ceremonies, wedding portraits, vacation snapshots, and countless images of grandchildren at every stage of their growing up. The basement still houses Theodore's meticulously organized woodworking shop, where he spent countless Saturday mornings crafting everything from birdhouses to dining room furniture. Theodore passed away 6 years ago after a mercifully brief battle with pancreatic cancer. Those final 4 months tested every ounce of strength I possessed, but they also revealed capabilities I never knew I had. I coordinated with oncologists and hospice workers, managed complex insurance paperwork, made end-of-life decisions when Theodore could no longer speak for himself, and somehow maintained enough composure to comfort our children and grandchildren through their grief while processing my own devastating loss. After the funeral, when the casseroles stopped arriving and the visitors returned to their normal routines, I faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding my life as a single person for the first time in 47 years. Friends and family members, all well-meaning, offered constant advice about my next steps. "The house is too big for one person, Dorothy," my neighbor Mrs. Patterson would say every time she saw me struggling with grocery bags. "You should think about one of those nice senior communities. They have activities and security, and you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance." But this house represents far more than just shelter. It's the repository of nearly half a century of memories. Theodore's presence still lingers in every room. I can still smell the aroma of his famous Sunday morning blueberry pancakes wafting from the kitchen. His reading glasses remain on the nightstand where he left them, next to the biography of Franklin Roosevelt he never finished. His garden tools hang in precise order in the garage, exactly as he arranged them during his final spring cleaning. More practically, this house represents financial security that I simply cannot replace. Theodore was incredibly disciplined about money throughout our marriage. He insisted we pay extra on the mortgage principal every month, even when money was tight during the children's college years. By the time he retired in 2005, we owned our home outright. Theodore also maintained detailed records of every improvement and upgrade we made over the years, from the new roof in 1995 to the updated electrical system in 2008 to the beautiful stone patio he installed himself in 2012. According to my neighbor, Mr. Chen, who works in real estate, houses on Elmwood Drive are now selling for $380,000 to $420,000. For someone living on Theodore's modest teacher pension and Social Security benefits, owning a debt-free asset of this magnitude provides a level of financial security that would be impossible to replicate in any other living situation. More importantly, it gives me independence and choices that I would lose the moment I sold. I have 3 children, and before this story began, I was genuinely proud of how they'd turned out. My eldest, Vanessa, is 48 years old and works as a regional sales manager for Meridian Pharmaceuticals. She's built an impressive career in a competitive field, earning a 6-figure salary that allows her to live in a sleek downtown Chicago condominium and drive luxury cars. Vanessa never married, always claiming she was too focused on professional advancement to settle down, though I sometimes wondered if her standards were simply too exacting for any real person to meet. Vanessa inherited Theodore's analytical mind and my stubborn determination, a combination that served her well in the business world, but sometimes made her difficult to connect with on a personal level. She approaches everything, including family relationships, with the same strategic thinking she applies to pharmaceutical sales territories. Conversations with Vanessa often feel like business meetings, with clear agendas and measurable outcomes, rather than the meandering, affectionate exchanges I shared with Theodore or experience with my other children. My middle child, Christopher, is 45 years old and works as a senior analyst for the Cook County Property Assessment Office. He's the steady, reliable one in our family, the child who thinks carefully before speaking and considers long-term consequences before making decisions. Christopher married his college sweetheart, Linda, 20 years ago, and they have 2 teenage daughters, Emma and Sophie, who are both honor students and accomplished athletes. They live in a comfortable ranch house in Riverside Meadows, about 25 minutes from me, in one of those established neighborhoods where the houses have character and the yards are large enough for vegetable gardens and swing sets. Christopher has always been my most emotionally available child, the one who calls just to chat rather than for specific reasons, the one who remembers details about things I mention in passing and follows up on them weeks later. When Theodore was sick, Christopher visited almost every day after work, helping with heavy lifting, running errands, or simply sitting with his father so I could take breaks to shower or nap. After the funeral, Christopher continued this pattern of regular check-ins, stopping by on weekends to help with household maintenance tasks, or just to share a cup of coffee and conversation. Then there's my youngest, Rebecca, who turned 42 last month. Rebecca married Jonathan Steinberg when she was 26, and from the beginning, it was clear that she was attracted to his potential for financial success, as much as his personality. Jonathan runs his own estate planning law practice in downtown Millbrook Heights, specializing in wills, trusts, and tax strategies for affluent clients. He's not an unpleasant man, exactly, but he has an unsettling habit of evaluating every situation through a financial lens, constantly calculating costs and benefits, rather than simply enjoying experiences for their own sake. Rebecca adopted many of Jonathan's attitudes after their marriage, becoming increasingly focused on material status and social positioning. They live in Willowbrook Estates, one of those newer developments where every house costs over $500,000, and the Homeowners Association enforces strict rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and acceptable holiday decorations. Their twin boys, Kevin and Kyle, are now 16 years old and involved in expensive activities that seem designed more to build impressive college application resumes than to provide genuine enjoyment or skill development. I've always tried not to judge my children's choices, understanding that each generation faces different challenges and opportunities. But I sometimes worry that Rebecca has lost sight of the values Theodore and I tried to instill about finding satisfaction in family relationships and personal accomplishments rather than external markers of success. The absolute
Light of my life, however, is my grandson Marcus, Vanessa's 19-year-old son. From the moment he was born, Marcus has been special in ways that go beyond the typical grandmother's bias. Vanessa was 29 when she had Marcus, and honestly, motherhood didn't come naturally to her. She approached parenting with the same systematic efficiency she brought to her career, treating Marcus's needs like items on a checklist rather than opportunities for bonding and connection. Even when Marcus was a toddler, Vanessa would frequently drop him off at my house for extended stays while she traveled for work or attended company conferences. I treasured those times. Marcus was such a curious, observant child, content to spend hours exploring my garden, asking thoughtful questions about plants and insects, or sitting quietly while I cooked, absorbing stories about his grandfather Theodore and the adventures we'd shared when we were young. As Marcus grew older, our bond only deepened. Every summer vacation, he'd spend at least 3 weeks with me. And rather than treating my house like a free hotel, he genuinely enjoyed participating in my daily routines. We'd work together on projects, organizing the basement storage room, refinishing pieces of furniture Theodore had built, or tackling seasonal maintenance tasks around the house. Marcus inherited his grandfather's mechanical aptitude and could troubleshoot problems with appliances, plumbing fixtures, or electrical systems that would have required expensive service calls if I'd faced them alone.
Marcus also possessed remarkable patience with technology challenges that frustrated me. When I struggled to understand online banking procedures or couldn't figure out how to video chat with out-of-town relatives, Marcus would sit beside me for however long it took, explaining each step clearly and never making me feel stupid or helpless. He had an intuitive understanding that learning new skills at 70 required different approaches than learning them at 20, and he adjusted his teaching methods accordingly. Now in his second year at Northern Illinois University, studying business administration with a computer science minor, Marcus has matured into a young man whose wisdom often surprises me. He's not just academically intelligent, though his grades certainly reflect intellectual capability, but emotionally perceptive in ways that seem beyond his years. Marcus notices subtleties in people's behavior and motivations that escape most adults, and he has an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone is being dishonest or manipulative. Where his mother, Vanessa, can be blunt to the point of rudeness, Marcus is diplomatic and considerate. Where his aunts and uncle sometimes seem driven primarily by financial considerations, Marcus values relationships, experiences, and personal integrity above material possessions. He's the kind of young person who gives me hope for the future, someone who seems to understand that success should be measured by more than just bank account balances and social status. What I appreciate most about Marcus is his protective instinct toward me, which manifests in thoughtful rather than patronizing ways. He never treats me as fragile or incapable, but he pays attention to details that might escape others. He notices when I seem tired or worried, remembers concerns I mention in passing, and follows up on them during subsequent visits. When Theodore died and I was overwhelmed by the maze of insurance claims, legal documents, and financial arrangements that accompany a spouse's death, 13-year-old Marcus spent his entire spring break helping me organize paperwork and create filing systems that I still use today. During his college years, Marcus has maintained remarkably consistent contact with me. He calls at least twice each week, not just to fulfill some obligation, but to have genuine conversations about his classes, his friends, his thoughts about future career directions, and his observations about the world around him. When he visits, which happens at least monthly during the academic year and much more frequently during breaks, he doesn't expect to be entertained or waited on. Instead, he looks for ways to contribute, fixing things that need repair, updating software on my computer, or simply keeping me company while I work in the garden or prepare meals. My house has always served as the central gathering place for family celebrations. Every birthday, holiday, anniversary, and significant milestone brought everyone together around my dining room table. I'd spend days preparing elaborate meals, setting out the good china and crystal stemware, arranging flowers from the garden, and making sure every detail created the perfect atmosphere for family connection. Theodore used to tease me about going overboard with these preparations, but he understood that creating these shared experiences was one of my greatest joys and sources of purpose. After Theodore's death, I wondered whether those family gatherings would continue. The house felt so empty without his storytelling and laughter, without his steady presence anchoring our celebrations, without his help with the endless tasks involved in hosting large family meals. But my children insisted that we maintain these traditions, and I was grateful for that continuity. Planning and executing these gatherings gave me something to look forward to and kept me connected to the family I'd devoted my life to nurturing. My kitchen, where I've prepared thousands of meals over the decades, remains the emotional heart of my home. It's not fancy by contemporary standards, white painted cabinets that Theodore installed himself in 1985, Formica countertops that show their age but remain perfectly functional, appliances that work reliably even if they lack the latest technological features. But it's a space saturated with love and memories. Every wall displays photographs spanning generations, school portraits, family vacation snapshots, wedding pictures, images of grandchildren at various ages and stages of development. My daily routine has evolved into comfortable, meaningful patterns that provide structure and purpose to my days. I wake naturally around 6:30 each morning, make coffee in the same ceramic mug Theodore gave me for my 40th birthday, and sit at the kitchen table reading the local newspaper, which I still have delivered despite repeated suggestions from Vanessa that online news sources would be more convenient and economical. After breakfast, weather permitting, I spend time working in the garden that Theodore and I developed together over many years. The flower beds require constant attention: weeding, deadheading, watering, seasonal planting, and replanting. The vegetable garden still produces more tomatoes, peppers, and herbs than I can use myself, so I regularly share the surplus with neighbors and donate boxes of fresh produce to the Millbrook Heights Food Pantry. When weather keeps me indoors, I work on various projects that keep the house organized and well maintained. I might spend a morning organizing closets, an afternoon mending clothing or household linens, or several hours updating the detailed financial records that Theodore insisted we maintain throughout our marriage. These tasks might seem mundane to some people, but they provide me with a sense of accomplishment and continuity. Twice each week, I volunteer at the Millbrook Heights Public Library, helping with their adult literacy program. Working with immigrants and adults who are learning to read for the first time is incredibly rewarding, and it keeps me connected to the broader community beyond my immediate neighborhood. The library work also provides intellectual stimulation and social interaction that I might otherwise miss. Every Thursday afternoon, I play bridge with three other women from the neighborhood: Margaret Silva, Carol Patterson, and Ruth Chen. This weekly game has been a constant in my life for almost 15 years, surviving divorces, health scares, the deaths of spouses, and various family crises among the four of us. We're all in our late 60s or 70s now, and our conversations cover everything from grandchildren's achievements to concerns about aging parents to local politics to book recommendations. Evenings are typically quiet and solitary, but not lonely. I might watch a classic movie on television, read books borrowed from the library, work on crossword puzzles, or call one of my children or old friends to catch up. I've never been afraid of spending time alone. Theodore and I raised our children to be independent and self-reliant, and I've applied those same principles to my own life after his death. I learned to navigate online banking, research contractors and service providers on the internet, troubleshoot minor household problems using YouTube tutorials, and handle the various maintenance tasks required to keep an older house functioning properly. These skills gave me confidence and pride, proof that I could adapt and continue learning even in my 70s. Financially, I've been fortunate. Theodore's careful planning throughout our marriage created a foundation of security that has allowed me to maintain my independence without constant worry about money. His teacher's pension provides steady monthly income, supplemented by Social Security benefits and modest returns from conservative investments he made over the years. We were never wealthy, but we lived within our means and saved consistently. And Theodore carried a life insurance policy that paid off our remaining debts after his death. The house itself represented my most significant asset, though I tried not to think about it in purely financial terms.
This was my home, not an investment property. But I wasn't naive about economic realities. I understood that if I ever required expensive medical care or needed to move to assisted living, the equity in the house would be crucial for maintaining my dignity and independence. My children had always been respectful of my autonomy and decision-making capabilities, at least until recently. They might offer suggestions or express concerns, but they generally trusted my judgment and supported my choices. Christopher would visit regularly to help with repairs or maintenance tasks that were beyond my physical capabilities. Rebecca would call frequently, though her conversations seemed hurried and task-oriented rather than genuinely personal. Vanessa maintained contact despite her demanding travel schedule, making special efforts to visit during major holidays and family celebrations. I believed we had developed healthy family dynamics based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Not perfect, no family is, but grounded in the values Theodore and I had worked hard to instill: honesty, loyalty, compassion, and commitment to supporting each other through life's inevitable challenges and transitions. Looking back now, I realize there were subtle changes in behavior and attitude that I dismissed or rationalized away. Conversations that seemed to focus increasingly on practical concerns: my health, my ability to maintain the house independently, my plans for future care needs, rather than the personal connections and shared experiences that had always been the foundation of our relationships. Questions about my financial situation became more frequent and detailed, though at the time I attributed them to natural concern for my well-being as I aged. Comments about the size and maintenance requirements of my house became more pointed, though I assumed they reflected genuine worry about my physical capabilities rather than interest in the property's value. But Marcus noticed patterns that escaped my attention, and during his visits, he'd make observations that seemed innocent but now feel prophetic. "Grandma, you don't need to share all your personal business with everyone," he'd say after family gatherings where I'd mentioned some household repair expense or discussed changes to my investment portfolio. "Some things should stay private." Or he'd ask questions about conversations I'd had with my aunts and uncle. "What exactly did Aunt Rebecca want to know about your bank accounts? Why was Uncle Christopher asking so many questions about property taxes and assessed values?" At the time, I thought he was being overly suspicious, perhaps influenced by the cynical worldview that seems common among young people who've grown up with constant warnings about identity theft and financial scams. I had been raised in an era when family members genuinely looked out for each other, when trust formed the foundation of family relationships, when the idea that your own children might have ulterior motives for their concern and attention seemed not just not likely, but insulting to the values you'd tried to teach them. But Marcus has always possessed unusual insight into people's motivations. Even as a small child, he could sense when someone was being dishonest or manipulative, and he had an uncanny ability to see through superficial charm to underlying intentions. I'd always admired this quality, even when it made him more cautious about forming friendships than I thought necessary for someone his age.
As I'm sharing this story with you now, I recognize how naive I was, how completely I trusted the people I loved most, how willing I was to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, even when evidence suggested I should be more careful. In many ways, that trust was beautiful. It reflected the kind of family I thought we were and the values I believed we shared. But it also made me vulnerable in ways I never could have imagined. The evening when Marcus whispered that urgent warning didn't emerge from nowhere, though at the time it felt completely unexpected and dramatic. There had been a series of conversations, suggestions, and small incidents over the previous months that individually seemed reasonable and caring, but together formed a pattern I was too trusting to recognize. That pattern and my family's true intentions were about to be revealed in the most shocking way possible. But before I tell you about that terrible night, let me explain how we got there, how a simple family dinner invitation set in motion events that would change everything I thought I knew about the people I'd spent my entire adult life loving and supporting. The changes in my family's behavior didn't happen overnight. Looking back, I can trace the shift to about 8 months before that fateful evening when Marcus saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. It started so subtly that I convinced myself I was imagining things, Or worse, that I was becoming one of those paranoid elderly people who see conspiracies everywhere. It began with Rebecca's phone calls becoming more frequent but oddly focused, where our conversations used to meander through topics like her boys' activities, neighborhood gossip, or memories we shared. She suddenly seemed intensely interested in very specific aspects of my life. She'd call on Sunday evenings, always at the same time, and after a few minutes of pleasantries, she'd steer the conversation toward my finances. "Mom, are you sure you're managing everything okay on your own?" she'd ask, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that sounds caring but feels invasive. I mean, with all the bills and investments and insurance policies, it must be overwhelming sometimes. I'd assure her that I was handling everything fine, that Theodore had taught me well, and that I actually enjoyed the challenge of managing our household finances independently. But Rebecca would persist, asking increasingly detailed questions about my monthly expenses, my savings accounts, whether I'd considered consolidating my investments for easier management. Jonathan was just saying how complicated estate planning can become as people age. He sees so many clients who waited too long to organize their affairs properly. Maybe you should come in for a consultation, just to make sure everything's in order. At first, I appreciated her concern. After all, Rebecca had married an estate planning attorney, so naturally she'd be aware of the importance of proper financial organization. And it was true that Theodore had handled most of our long-term financial decisions during our marriage. Maybe it would be wise to have a professional review to ensure I hadn't overlooked anything important. But something about the timing felt odd. These conversations always happened when Marcus wasn't around, when I was alone in the house on quiet Sunday evenings. And Rebecca never seemed satisfied with my answers, no matter how thoroughly I explained my systems for managing bills, tracking investments, or maintaining household records. Christopher's behavior changed too, though his approach was more subtle than Rebecca's direct questioning. He'd continue his regular visits, but instead of our usual easy conversations about his daughter's activities or neighborhood happenings, he'd focus intently on the condition of my house. He'd walk through rooms with the calculating gaze of an appraiser, pointing out maintenance issues that needed attention. "Mom, this roof is getting pretty old," he'd say, running his hands along windowsills and examining paint conditions. "Have you thought about what it'll cost to replace it when the time comes? And the furnace is at least 15 years old now. These major systems can fail without warning, and the repair costs can be devastating for someone on a fixed income." Christopher would spend entire visits cataloging potential problems: the aging electrical panel in the basement, hairline cracks in the foundation walls, outdated plumbing fixtures that might need replacement, windows that could benefit from energy-efficient upgrades. He'd write detailed notes about each issue, complete with rough cost estimates that always seemed alarmingly high. "I'm just worried about you being house poor," he'd explain when I pointed out that the house was structurally sound and perfectly comfortable. "You could be sitting on a fortune and equity while struggling to maintain a property that's becoming too expensive and demanding for someone your age." The most unsettling part of these conversations was Christopher's insistence on documenting everything. He'd take photographs of minor cosmetic issues, measure rooms, and create spreadsheets comparing the costs of various repairs and improvements to the potential increase in property value. It felt less like a son's concern for his mother's well-being and more like a professional assessment of a valuable asset. Even Vanessa, usually so focused on her own career demands that family concerns took a backseat, began showing unprecedented interest in my daily life and future plans. During her visits, she'd pepper me with questions about my health, my energy levels, my ability to handle household tasks that had never been challenging before. "Mom, you seem tired," she'd observe, even on days when I felt perfectly energetic. "Are you sure you're getting enough sleep? Are you eating properly? Maybe you should consider hiring someone to help with cleaning and yard work." Vanessa would study my movements as I cooked dinner or worked in the garden, making comments about how much effort these activities required, how dangerous it might be for someone my age to climb stepladders or lift heavy objects, how isolated I was living alone in such a large house. What would happen if you fell and couldn't reach the phone? She'd ask, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine worry. What if you had a medical emergency at night and no one found you until days later? Marcus worries about these things too, you know. That last comment particularly bothered me because I knew it wasn't true. Marcus had never expressed concerns about my safety or independence. If anything, he consistently praised my self-reliance and encouraged my efforts to master new skills and maintain my autonomy. But Vanessa's suggestion that my beloved grandson was secretly worried about me planted seeds of doubt that grew larger with each subsequent conversation. The three siblings began coordinating their efforts in ways that felt increasingly orchestrated. Rebecca would call to express concerns about my financial management. Then Christopher would visit to document expensive maintenance needs. Then Vanessa would follow up with observations about my declining physical capabilities. Each conversation built on the previous one, creating a narrative about my increasing vulnerability and the growing burden of maintaining my independence. During family gatherings, they'd exchange meaningful glances when I mentioned routine activities like grocery shopping or minor household repairs. They'd interrupt my stories about library volunteer work or bridge games to ask detailed questions about my driving abilities, my memory, my overall health status. What had once been celebratory occasions filled with laughter and shared memories became subtle interrogations about my competence and capacity for independent living. The shift was so gradual and seemed so well-intentioned that I struggled to identify exactly what felt wrong. These were my children, people I'd raised to be caring and responsible adults. Of course, they were concerned about my well-being as I aged. Of course, they wanted to ensure I was safe and financially secure. Their questions and observations reflected natural parental concern, didn't they? But Marcus noticed what I was trying so hard to ignore. During his visits, he'd make comments that seemed casual but carried deeper meaning. "Grandma, you don't have to justify your choices to everyone," he'd say after family dinners where I'd found myself explaining and defending routine decisions about household management or daily activities. "You're perfectly capable of making your own decisions about how to live your life." Or he'd ask pointed questions about conversations I'd had with his aunts and uncle. "Why does Aunt Rebecca need to know so much about your bank accounts? Why is Uncle Christopher making lists of everything that needs repair in your house? Since when does Mom care so much about whether you're eating enough vegetables?" Marcus had an uncanny ability to cut through the superficial concern and identify the underlying agenda that I was still too trusting to see clearly. He'd point out inconsistencies in their behavior, like how they suddenly seemed worried about my driving abilities, despite the fact that I'd never had an accident or traffic violation in my entire life, or how they questioned my mental sharpness, even though I consistently beat them all at card games and could remember details about their lives that they'd forgotten themselves. "Something's not right about this sudden interest in your personal business," Marcus said during one of his weekend visits in early spring. We were working together in the garden, preparing flower beds for seasonal planting, and he'd been unusually quiet all morning. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "They're building a case against you," he said bluntly. "All these questions about your finances, all this documentation about house repairs, all these observations about your health and energy levels. They're creating a narrative about why you can't or shouldn't live independently anymore." "But why would they do that?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I suspected I knew the answer. Marcus straightened up from the flower bed and looked directly at me with those wise eyes that seemed far too old for his 19-year-old face. "Because this house is worth a lot of money, Grandma, and they think they know better than you do about how to manage your life." That conversation planted a seed of awareness that grew stronger with each subsequent family interaction. I began paying closer attention to the patterns Marcus had identified, listening more carefully to the underlying messages in my children's seemingly caring conversations. Rebecca's interest in my financial affairs wasn't motivated by a concern about my ability to manage money. It was reconnaissance gathering. She wanted to understand exactly what assets I controlled and how they were structured. Her suggestions about meeting with Jonathan weren't about protecting my interests, but about bringing my estate planning under their influence. Christopher's obsession with documenting house maintenance needs wasn't about helping me prepare for necessary repairs. It was about building a case that the property had become too expensive and burdensome for me to maintain independently. His cost estimates were consistently inflated, and his assessments focused on problems that were either minor or entirely hypothetical. Vanessa's sudden concern about my health and safety wasn't based on any actual decline in my capabilities. It was about establishing a narrative of increasing frailty and vulnerability that would justify intervention in my living arrangements. They were working together, whether consciously coordinated or through some unspoken family consensus, to convince me that I could no longer handle independent living. And they were documenting everything to support that conclusion, creating a paper trail of evidence that could be used to override my preferences if I resisted their eventual recommendations. The realization was devastating, not just because of what it revealed about their motivations, but because of what it said about their perception of me. These were the children I'd raised, supported through college, helped launch into successful careers, celebrated with during their achievements, and comforted through their struggles. And they saw me as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a person whose autonomy deserved respect. But the most painful aspect of this awakening was understanding how skillfully they'd been manipulating me. Every conversation had been carefully crafted to plant doubts about my judgment while positioning them as helpful, caring children who only wanted what was best for me. They'd used my love for them and my trust in their good intentions as weapons against my own self-confidence and decision-making abilities. I began to notice other troubling patterns that I'd previously overlooked. When friends or neighbors complimented my energy, independence, or sharp mind, my children would quickly redirect the conversation to discuss challenges I faced or concerns they had about my living situation. When I mentioned new skills I'd learned or projects I'd completed successfully, they'd focus on how difficult or dangerous those activities were for someone my age. They were systematically undermining my reputation within our social circle, creating a public narrative that supported their private agenda of proving I needed more supervision and assistance than I actually required. During my weekly bridge games, I started hearing comments that reflected this influence. Rebecca mentioned you've been having trouble with household maintenance. Christopher said you're finding the grocery shopping more challenging these days. Vanessa thinks you might be getting a little forgetful. None of these characterizations were accurate, but they were being repeated often enough that people began accepting them as truth. My children were actively sabotaging my reputation for competence and independence within the community where I'd lived and contributed for decades. The manipulation extended to holiday celebrations and family gatherings at my house. Where these occasions had once been joyful celebrations of our family bonds, they became opportunities for my children to perform their concerns publicly, making comments about my abilities and limitations in front of grandchildren and spouses who wouldn't question their assessments. They'd offer to help with tasks I'd been managing independently for years, then use my polite refusals as evidence of stubbornness or denial about my declining capabilities. They'd express worry about my living alone, then point to my protests as proof that I wasn't thinking clearly about my own best interests. Even worse, they began involving the grandchildren in their campaign. Kevin and Kyle, Rebecca's 16-year-old twins, started making comments during visits about how big and empty my house seemed, how scary it must be living alone, how much easier my life would be in a smaller place with less responsibility. These observations felt coached rather than spontaneous, as if they'd been instructed about what to notice and mention. The only family member who remained consistently supportive and genuine was Marcus, which made my children's behavior even more glaring by contrast. Marcus continued to treat me with the same respect and affection he'd always shown me, never questioning my judgment or capabilities, never expressing artificial concern about my independent living situation. But I noticed that my other children had begun excluding Marcus from certain family conversations, scheduling discussions during times when he was at university or otherwise unavailable. They seemed to recognize that his presence complicated their efforts to build consensus around their narrative of my increasing incapacity and need for intervention.
The isolation was subtle but effective. They were gradually separating me from the family member most likely to support my autonomy while surrounding me with voices that consistently questioned my judgment and capabilities. The psychological pressure was enormous, and I found myself beginning to doubt perceptions and decisions that had seemed perfectly clear before their campaign began. I started second-guessing routine choices about everything from grocery shopping to household maintenance. When the refrigerator made an unusual noise, instead of simply calling a repair service as I'd done countless times before, I found myself wondering whether I was capable of managing the situation appropriately. When I felt tired after a day of yard work, instead of recognizing it as normal fatigue, I worried that it might indicate declining physical capacity. The constant questioning of my competence was eroding my self-confidence in ways that were both subtle and profound. I was becoming the uncertain, vulnerable person they were portraying me to be, not because my actual capabilities had declined, but because their relentless pressure was making me doubt everything about myself. This psychological manipulation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their campaign, because it used my own love and trust against me. I wanted to believe that my children had my best interests at heart, that their concerns reflected genuine care rather than self-serving calculation. The alternative, accepting that they were deliberately undermining my autonomy for their own benefit, was almost too painful to contemplate. But Marcus's observations and my growing awareness of the patterns made denial increasingly difficult. The evidence was accumulating that my children were executing a systematic plan to convince me and everyone around me that I could no longer handle independent living. And they were succeeding, not just in changing other people's perceptions, but in shaking my own confidence in ways that felt deeply damaging to my sense of self-worth and identity. The stage was being set for some kind of intervention, some moment when their months of preparation would culminate in a direct challenge to my living arrangements. I could sense it building like a storm on the horizon, and I felt increasingly powerless to prevent whatever they had planned. But I had no idea how devastating that storm would be when it finally broke, or how much I would need Marcus's protection when the moment of crisis finally arrived. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was in my kitchen enjoying my usual breakfast of toast and coffee while reading the Millbrook Heights Gazette when the telephone rang at exactly 8:47 a.m. I remember the precise time because I'd just glanced at the clock on the microwave, thinking how punctual the newspaper delivery had been that day. "Mom, it's Rebecca," came my youngest daughter's voice, but something in her tone immediately put me on alert. There was an artificial brightness to it, the kind forced cheer people use when they're about to deliver news they know won't be well received. "I hope I'm not calling too early, but Jonathan and I have been talking, and we think it's time we had that family meeting we've been discussing." I set down my coffee cup carefully, trying to process what she was saying. "What family meeting, sweetheart? I don't recall us discussing any family meeting." There was a pause, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background, as if Rebecca was conferring with someone else before responding. "Oh, you know, the one about getting your affairs organized. Jonathan has been working on some documents that will make everything so much simpler for you, and we thought it would be nice to have everyone together to go over them." My stomach began to tighten with an uneasiness I couldn't quite name. "What kind of documents, Rebecca? And what do you mean by getting my affairs organized? My affairs are perfectly organized already." "Mom, please don't be defensive," Rebecca said, and now I could hear the edge beneath her cheerful facade. "We're just trying to help. Jonathan has prepared some paperwork that will protect you and make sure all your wishes are properly documented. It's really just a formality, but it's important to have everything legal and official." The word legal sent a chill down my spine. In my experience, when family members started talking about legal documents and official paperwork, it usually meant someone was about to lose control over something important. "Rebecca, I need you to be more specific. What exactly are these documents?" Another pause, longer this time. "Well, there's a revised will, of course, and some power of attorney forms and a few other things that Jonathan says are standard for someone in your situation. Nothing complicated, just smart planning for the future." Power of attorney forms. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I'd learned enough about elder law from reading articles and listening to discussions at the senior center to know that power of attorney documents could give another person complete control over someone's financial and legal decisions. "Rebecca, why would I need to give anyone power of attorney? I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "Mom, nobody's saying you're not capable," but Rebecca's tone suggested exactly the opposite. "It's just that things can happen unexpectedly at our age, and it's better to have these arrangements in place before they're needed. Jonathan sees this all the time in his practice, families who wait too long and then face terrible complications when emergencies arise."
The patronizing reference to our age made my jaw clench. Rebecca was 42 years old, hardly in a position to lecture me about the challenges of aging. But more disturbing was the implication that my family had been discussing my mental and physical competence behind my back, apparently with enough concern that they felt legal intervention was necessary. "I appreciate your concern," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "but I'm not interested in signing any power of attorney documents right now. If I ever feel I need that kind of assistance, I'll certainly consider it. But at the moment, I'm managing everything just fine." "But Mom, that's exactly the problem," Rebecca said, and now the artificial sweetness was completely gone from her voice. "People in your situation often don't realize when they need help. That's why it's so important to have these protections in place before judgment becomes impaired." Before judgment becomes impaired. The phrase was like a slap across the face. My own daughter was suggesting, not very subtly, that my mental faculties were declining and that I could no longer be trusted to make rational decisions about my own life. "Rebecca," I said, my voice growing cold, "my judgment is not impaired. I balance my checkbook, manage my investments, maintain my house, drive safely, cook my own meals, and handle every aspect of my life without assistance or supervision. I don't know what's given you the impression that I need legal guardianship, but you're mistaken." "But Mom, that's exactly the problem," Rebecca said, and now the artificial sweetness was completely gone from her voice. "People in your situation often don't realize when they need help. That's why it's so important to have these protections in place before judgment becomes impaired." Before judgment becomes impaired. The phrase was like a slap across the face. My own daughter was suggesting, not very subtly, that my mental faculties were declining and that I could no longer be trusted to make rational decisions about my own life. "Rebecca," I said, my voice growing cold, "my judgment is not impaired. I balance my checkbook, manage my investments, maintain my house, drive safely, cook my own meals, and handle every aspect of my life without assistance or supervision. I don't know what's given you the impression that I need legal guardianship, but you're mistaken." "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," Rebecca said, and I could hear desperation creeping into her voice. "We've all been worried about you. Living alone in that big house, managing all those financial responsibilities, dealing with maintenance and repairs, it's too much for anyone your age to handle independently." "All been worried,"
So this wasn't just Rebecca's initiative, but a coordinated family effort. The months of subtle questioning and documented concerns suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. They'd been building a case against my competence, gathering evidence to support this moment when they would present me with legal documents designed to strip away my autonomy. Who exactly is we all, Rebecca? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Well, Vanessa and Christopher and I have all been discussing it, and we're in complete agreement that something needs to be done. Even some of your neighbors have mentioned concerns to us about whether you're really managing everything as well as you think you are. The betrayal cut deep. Not only had my children been conspiring against me, but they'd been actively soliciting outside opinions to support their narrative. They'd been going around the neighborhood, apparently, gathering what they considered evidence of my declining capabilities from people who barely knew me well enough to make such judgments. What neighbors and what concerns? Does it really matter? Rebecca said impatiently. The point is that everyone who cares about you can see that you need more support than you're getting. We're trying to provide that support in the most loving and protective way possible. Loving and protective? The words felt like mockery given the manipulative campaign I now realized they'd been conducting. There was nothing loving about undermining someone's confidence and autonomy, nothing protective about gathering ammunition to use against a family member's independence. Rebecca, I want to be very clear about something, I said, my voice gaining strength as my anger grew. I am not signing any power of attorney documents. I am not revising my will under pressure from you and your siblings. And I am deeply hurt and offended that you would orchestrate this kind of intervention without even discussing your concerns with me directly. But that's just it, Mom. We have been discussing our concerns with you over and over, but you won't listen. You dismiss everything we say and insist that you're fine when we can all see that you're not. That's exactly why Jonathan says these legal protections are so important. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd spent months planting seeds of doubt and manufacturing crises, then used my reasonable responses to their manufactured concerns as evidence that I was in denial about my declining capabilities. I'm hanging up now, Rebecca, and I want you to tell Jonathan that I will not be needing his legal services, now or in the future. But Mom, wait! Her voice rose to near panic. You can't just dismiss this. We've already made arrangements. Everyone is planning to come over Thursday evening to discuss this properly. Jonathan has cleared his schedule, and Vanessa is driving in from the city, and Christopher is bringing Linda for moral support. You can't just cancel on everyone at the last minute. The presumption was staggering. They'd planned an ambush, scheduled a family meeting at my house without consulting me, and now expected me to cooperate with their scheme simply because they'd gone to the trouble of coordinating their calendars? I absolutely can cancel, because I never agreed to host any such meeting in the first place, I said firmly. You don't get to schedule family interventions at my house without my permission, especially when the purpose is to pressure me into signing legal documents I don't want or need.
Fine, Rebecca said, her voice turning cold and sharp. If you won't cooperate, then maybe we need to explore other options. Jonathan says there are legal procedures for situations like this when family members refuse to accept help they obviously need. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. She was suggesting that if I wouldn't voluntarily surrender control of my affairs, they were prepared to pursue involuntary measures. The idea that my own children would consider having me declared mentally incompetent filled me with a combination of terror and rage that left me temporarily speechless. You wouldn't dare, I finally whispered. We don't want to, Mom, but if you force our hand, Rebecca's voice trailed off, leaving the implication clear. They were prepared to go to court, to have me legally declared incapable of managing my own affairs if I refused to comply with their demands voluntarily. I hung up the phone without another word,
my hands shaking with fury and fear. The conversation had revealed the full scope of their betrayal and the lengths to which they were prepared to go to gain control over my life and assets. This wasn't about love or protection, it was about power and money disguised as family concern. The phone rang again immediately, and I could see Rebecca's number on the caller ID. I didn't answer. It rang 4 more times over the next hour, alternating between Rebecca's number and Christopher's, but I ignored them all. I needed time to think, to process what had just been revealed, and to figure out how to respond to this unprecedented assault on my autonomy. By afternoon, my initial shock had crystallized into cold, determined anger. I called Marcus at his university, reaching him between classes. "Grandma, is everything okay? You sound upset." I told him everything about Rebecca's call, about their plans for a family meeting I'd never agreed to, about the power of attorney documents and the threats of legal action if I refused to cooperate. Marcus listened without interruption, and I could practically hear his mind working as he absorbed the implications. "They're planning to ambush you Thursday night," he said when I finished. "They want to get you surrounded by family members and pressure you into signing those documents before you have time to think clearly or get independent advice." "That's exactly what I thought too," I said. "Marcus, I'm scared. I've never seen this side of them before, and I don't know how far they're willing to go." "Grandma, listen to me carefully," Marcus said, his voice taking on a mature authority that belied his 19 years. "Do not sign anything they bring to your house. No matter what they say, no matter how much pressure they apply, do not put your signature on any documents until you've had them reviewed by an independent attorney." "But they're my children, Marcus. Part of me still can't believe they would actually try to hurt me." "They're not trying to hurt you intentionally," Marcus said gently. "They've probably convinced themselves that they're acting in your best interests, but the result is the same whether their motives are selfish or misguided. If you sign those documents, you'll lose control over your own life, and once that happens, it's extremely difficult to get it back." Marcus was right, of course. I'd read enough stories about elder abuse and family financial exploitation to know that power of attorney documents were often the first step in a process that ended with elderly people being stripped of their homes, their savings, and their independence, all in the name of their own protection. "What should I do?" I asked. "First, you need to document everything. Write down exactly what Rebecca said during that phone call, including her threats about legal procedures. Keep records of all their previous conversations about your finances and living situation. If this ends up in court, you'll need evidence of their campaign to undermine your competence." "Do you really think it could end up in court?" "I hope not, but you need to be prepared for that possibility. These power of attorney documents they want you to sign, Grandma, they're not just suggestions. Once you sign them, your children will have legal authority to make decisions about your money, your property, even your medical care, whether you agree with those decisions or not." The full horror of the situation began to sink in. If I signed those documents, I could lose everything: my house, my savings, my right to make my own choices about where to live and how to spend my remaining years. And once signed, those documents would be extremely difficult to revoke, especially if my children used their new authority to control my access to legal representation. "There's something else you should know," Marcus continued. "I overheard Mom talking to Aunt Rebecca a few weeks ago about property values in your neighborhood. They know exactly how much your house is worth, and they were discussing the tax advantages of different strategies for transferring ownership." My heart sank. So this really was about money, specifically about gaining control of my most valuable asset. The house that Theodore and I had spent decades paying for,
The home where I'd raised my children and planned to live out my remaining years was being viewed by those same children as a financial opportunity to be seized. Marcus, I need you here Thursday night. I know you have classes, but I don't think I can face them alone.
I'll be there, Grandma. I wouldn't miss it. But I want you to promise me something. No matter what they say, no matter how much they pressure you, don't sign anything that night. Tell them you need time to think about it, that you want to have the documents reviewed by your own attorney. Give yourself time and space to make these decisions without their pressure. After I hung up with Marcus, I spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday in a strange state of suspended animation, waiting for the confrontation I knew was coming. The phone rang constantly, my children taking turns calling to pressure me to reconsider, to apologize for their misunderstanding of my position, to explain how much trouble they'd gone to in preparing for Thursday's meeting. Each conversation followed the same pattern: artificial concern about my welfare, subtle suggestions about my declining judgment, and increasingly explicit warnings about what might happen if I continued to resist their help. They were using every psychological manipulation tactic in the book: guilt, fear, love, obligation, to wear down my resistance and make me compliant. But Marcus's words echoed in my mind. Don't sign anything. Whatever else happened, whatever pressure they applied, I would not surrender control of my life and assets to people who had spent months systematically undermining my confidence and autonomy. Thursday evening arrived like an execution date. At exactly 6:30 p.m., cars began pulling into my driveway. First Christopher and Linda, then Vanessa in her sleek BMW, and finally Rebecca and Jonathan in his expensive Mercedes sedan. I watched from my living room window as they gathered in my driveway, conferring among themselves before approaching the house, and I felt like a prisoner watching her captors prepare for interrogation. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath before answering. My 3 children and their spouses stood on my porch, all dressed as if for a business meeting rather than a family gathering. Jonathan carried a leather briefcase that I assumed contained the documents they intended to pressure me into signing. "Hello, Mom," Christopher said, leaning in to kiss my cheek as if this were a normal social visit. "You look tired. Are you feeling all right?" And so it began. The same subtle undermining of my competence that had characterized their behavior for months, but now intensified and focused toward a specific goal. They were going to spend the evening systematically breaking down my resistance until I agreed to sign away my autonomy. But they had no idea that Marcus was already in the house, or that I'd spent 2 days preparing for this confrontation with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The battle for my independence was about to begin, and I was no longer the confused, vulnerable target they thought I was. They filed into my living room with the practiced efficiency of a corporate takeover team. Jonathan immediately claimed the chair closest to my coffee table, spreading out his leather briefcase and withdrawing a stack of official-looking documents. My 3 children positioned themselves strategically around the room: Christopher on the sofa, where he could maintain eye contact with me, Vanessa near the window where she could pace if needed, and Rebecca in the armchair that gave her the best view of both me and the documents Jonathan was organizing. Their spouses, Linda, and Rebecca's husband, Jonathan, arranged themselves as silent witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. The whole setup felt choreographed, as if they'd rehearsed their positions and roles before arriving. "Mom, why don't you sit here?" Rebecca suggested, patting the cushion next to Christopher on the sofa. "That way you can see the documents clearly when Jonathan explains them." I remained standing near the doorway to the kitchen, keeping my options open. "I'm fine where I am, thank you." Jonathan cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with the self-importance of someone about to deliver a prepared presentation. "Dorothy, I want to begin by saying how much I appreciate you allowing us to come here tonight. I know these conversations can be difficult, but they're absolutely necessary for your protection and peace of mind." The condescension in his voice was immediate and unmistakable. He was speaking to me the way adults speak to children who are about to receive unpleasant but necessary medicine. I felt my jaw tighten, but I remained silent, waiting to see how far they intended to push this charade. He slid the document across the coffee table toward the sofa where Rebecca had wanted me to sit. The key changes involve establishing a family trust that will provide better protection for your estate and more flexibility for managing your assets during your lifetime. I stepped closer to examine the papers without sitting down. Even from a distance, I could see that the document was much more complex than my current will, filled with legal terminology that would be difficult for a layperson to understand fully. Jonathan, I'd like to have my own attorney review any changes to my will before signing anything, I said calmly. This is quite a bit more complicated than what Fyodor and I originally established. The reaction was immediate and telling. My children exchanged glances that clearly communicated frustration with my response, as if they'd anticipated this objection and prepared counter-arguments. "Mom, that's exactly the kind of unnecessary delay that creates problems," Vanessa said, her voice taking on the impatient tone she used with clients who questioned her recommendations. "Jonathan has already spent hours customizing these documents specifically for your situation. Getting another attorney involved will just create confusion and delays." "Besides," Christopher added, "Jonathan is already familiar with your financial situation and family dynamics. An outside attorney would need weeks just to understand the basics of what Jonathan has already analyzed thoroughly." The presumption that Jonathan was familiar with my financial situation sent a chill down my spine. How exactly had he gained access to information about my private affairs? And what did Christopher mean by family dynamics? Were they referring to their own campaign to undermine my independence? "I appreciate Jonathan's work," I said carefully, "but I'm not comfortable signing legal documents without independent review, especially documents this complex. Any competent attorney should be able to understand my situation quickly enough." Rebecca's face flushed with anger that she was trying hard to control. "Mom, you're being unreasonably suspicious. Jonathan is family. He's not some stranger trying to take advantage of you. He's trying to protect you. And frankly, your refusal to trust him is exactly the kind of poor judgment we've all been worried about." There it was again, the suggestion that my reasonable caution about legal documents represented impaired judgment rather than prudent decision-making. They were using my own sensible responses as evidence of the mental decline they'd been alleging. "Let's move on to the next document," Jonathan said smoothly, clearly trying to maintain control of the meeting. "This is a durable power of attorney for financial affairs. It would allow your children to manage your finances if you become temporarily or permanently unable to do so yourself." He placed another thick document on the coffee table. "The beauty of this arrangement is that it only becomes active if and when you need assistance. Until then, you maintain complete control over your accounts and decisions. But if something happens, a medical emergency, a period of confusion, even something as simple as being hospitalized for a few days, your children can immediately step in to pay bills, manage investments, and handle other financial responsibilities without bureaucratic delays." The document looked official and intimidating, filled with legal language that would give my children broad authority over every aspect of my financial life. I could see sections dealing with banking, investments, real estate transactions, insurance policies, and tax filings. "What exactly would trigger this power of attorney becoming active?" I asked. "Well, typically, it's activated when your physician determines that you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs, or if you're temporarily incapacitated due to illness or injury. The document includes specific language about the criteria for activation to protect against misuse." But I noticed that the criteria weren't as specific as Jonathan claimed. The language appeared to give significant discretion to my children about when they felt intervention was necessary. And the medical evaluation requirement seemed vague enough to be satisfied by almost any doctor's opinion about age-related changes in cognitive function. I am still not seeing why this is necessary right now. I'm managing my finances perfectly well. I am in good health, and I have no indication that either of those circumstances is likely to change in the immediate future. "But that's exactly the point, Mom," Christopher said, leaning forward with the patient expression he'd perfected during his years as a county bureaucrat dealing with difficult property owners. Nobody plans to have a stroke or develop dementia or fall and break a hip. These things happen suddenly, and if you wait until they're needed, it's too late to put legal protections in place. Christopher's absolutely right, Vanessa added. I see this all the time in my work with pharmaceutical companies. Families who didn't plan ahead end up facing terrible complications when medical crises arise. Adult children who can't access their parents' accounts to pay for necessary care, medical bills that go unpaid because nobody has authority to manage finances, assets that get frozen by bureaucratic red tape. Their arguments sounded reasonable on the surface, but something felt deeply wrong about the pressure they were applying. If these documents were truly for my protection and benefit, why were they so insistent that I signed immediately without independent review?
There's also this, Jonathan said, placing a third document on the table. A healthcare power of attorney that would allow your children to make medical decisions if you're unable to communicate your preferences clearly. This document was perhaps the most troubling of all. It would give my children authority to make decisions about my medical care, including potentially life and death choices, based on their interpretation of my best interests rather than my explicitly stated wishes. Jonathan, I already have healthcare directives in place, I said. Theodore and I updated them just a few years before he passed away. Those documents are probably outdated, Rebecca interjected. Healthcare laws change constantly, and older directives often don't include provisions for newer medical technologies and treatment options. More importantly, Jonathan added, your current healthcare directives probably don't account for your changed family circumstances. When Theodore was alive, he would naturally have been your primary healthcare advocate. Now that responsibility needs to be transferred to your children, and this document formalizes that arrangement. The logic seemed sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were creating solutions to problems that didn't actually exist. My current healthcare directives were clear and comprehensive, and I'd never indicated any desire to change the decision-making authority they established. I need to use the restroom, I said, needing a moment away from the pressure and intensity of their collective focus. Please excuse me for a few minutes. As I walked toward the hallway bathroom, I heard them immediately begin discussing strategy in low, urgent voices. I couldn't make out the specific words, but their tones suggested frustration with my resistance and debate about how to overcome it. Instead of going to the bathroom, I quietly climbed the stairs to the second floor, where I knew Marcus was waiting in my bedroom. He was sitting at my desk with his laptop open, and he looked up with concern when I entered. "How's it going down there?" he whispered. "Worse than I expected," I said quietly. "They have 3 different documents they want me to sign. A new will, financial power of attorney, and healthcare power of attorney. Jonathan is making it sound like routine paperwork, but these documents would give them complete control over every aspect of my life." Marcus's expression darkened. "Grandma, those aren't routine documents. Financial power of attorney can be used to sell your house, withdraw your savings, and make investment decisions without your consent. Healthcare power of attorney can be used to override your medical preferences and even make decisions about life support or nursing home placement." That's what I was afraid of. But they're making it sound like I'm being unreasonable for wanting independent legal review. "You're being completely reasonable," Marcus said firmly. "What they're asking for is extraordinary authority over your life, and any honest attorney would encourage you to get a second opinion before signing such documents." I could hear voices from downstairs becoming more animated, and I realized I needed to return before they became suspicious about my extended absence. "Stay close," I whispered to Marcus. "I think things are going to get worse before they get better." When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. My children and Jonathan were no longer maintaining the pretense of casual family discussion. Their expressions were serious and determined, and I sensed that they decided to abandon subtle persuasion in favor of more direct pressure. "Mom, we need to talk honestly about what's really happening here," Vanessa said as I sat down. "Your resistance to these documents is exactly the kind of stubborn behavior that's been worrying us for months. We've all noticed changes in your judgment and decision-making abilities. Small things at first, forgetting conversations we'd had, repeating stories, asking the same questions multiple times. But lately, the problems have become more serious." I stared at them in disbelief. "What problems? What are you talking about?"
Rebecca put out a small notebook and began reading from it. 3 weeks ago, you called me twice in the same day asking whether I was coming to Sunday dinner, even though we'd already confirmed the arrangements. Last month, you told Vanessa that you paid your property taxes, but when Christopher checked with the county office, the payment was 2 weeks late. 2 weeks ago, Vanessa continued, you invited Mrs. Chen over for coffee, but then seemed surprised when she showed up at your door. And Linda mentioned that during Emma's birthday party, you introduced yourself to people you'd known for years. The accusations hit me like physical blows. Some of these incidents had simple explanations. I'd called Rebecca twice about dinner because I had been genuinely uncertain about her response the first time. The property tax payment was delayed due to a postal service mix-up, and I'd been surprised by Mrs. Chen's visit because we'd made tentative plans that I didn't expect her to take seriously. But other accusations were simply false. I distinctly remember the conversations they claimed I'd forgotten, and I'd never introduced myself to people I already knew at Emma's birthday party. They were either misinterpreting normal social interactions or deliberately fabricating incidents to support their narrative of my declining mental capacity.
Those examples are either inaccurate or perfectly normal, I said, my anger beginning to overcome my shock. Everyone occasionally asks questions twice or gets confused about social arrangements. None of that indicates cognitive impairment. But that's exactly what someone with early cognitive decline would say, Jonathan interjected smoothly. Denial and defensiveness are classic symptoms of the early stages of dementia. People in your situation genuinely don't realize that their abilities are declining. The room fell silent as the implication of his words sank in. They weren't just questioning my judgment about legal documents, they were suggesting that I was developing dementia and lacked the capacity to recognize my own mental decline. Jonathan, I am not developing dementia, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. I am a sharp, competent woman who is perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. The fact that I'm questioning your motives and refusing to sign documents I don't fully understand is evidence of good judgment, not impairment. Mom, please don't raise your voice, said Rebecca with artificial calm. Getting agitated isn't going to help anyone think clearly about the situation. Even my emotional response to their outrageous accusations was being used as evidence against me. They'd created a perfect trap. Any reaction I had to their manipulation would be interpreted as further proof of the mental instability they were alleging. The psychological cruelty of their strategy was breathtaking. They'd spent months systematically undermining my confidence, then used my reasonable responses to their pressure as evidence that I was losing my mental faculties. And now they were demanding that I sign legal documents that would formalize their authority over my life based on the very decline they'd manufactured through their own manipulation. I looked around the room at these people I'd raised, supported, and loved unconditionally for decades, and I realized that they no longer saw me as their mother, or even as a fully autonomous human being. I'd become an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved, a valuable asset to be controlled. And they were just getting started. The tension in the room had reached a suffocating peak. My children sat around me like judges at a tribunal, their faces set with the grim determination of people convinced they were doing the right thing regardless of my protests. Jonathan continued shuffling through his documents, clearly frustrated that his carefully orchestrated presentation wasn't proceeding according to plan. Dorothy, let's try a different approach, Jonathan said, his voice taking on the patient but firm tone doctors use with difficult patients. I'm going to read you the key provisions of each document, and you can ask questions as we go. But I think once you understand what we're proposing, you'll see that we really are looking out for your best interests. He picked up the financial power of attorney and began reading in a monotone voice that made the legal language sound even more impenetrable. As he droned on about fiduciary responsibilities and successor trustees, I noticed my children watching me with an intensity that felt predatory. They were studying my reactions, looking for signs of confusion or fatigue that they could later cite as evidence of my declining mental faculties. Jonathan, Stop, I said firmly. I've heard enough. I understand what these documents do, and I'm not signing any of them tonight. The reaction was swift and coordinated, as if they'd rehearsed this moment. Mom, you're making a huge mistake, Vanessa said, her professional composure finally cracking completely. We're trying to help you, and you're being incredibly stubborn and short-sighted. This is exactly what we were afraid of, Christopher added, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. You're so focused on maintaining control that you can't see how much you need our support. Rebecca stood up and began pacing, her frustration boiling over. Fine, Mom. If you won't accept our help voluntarily, then maybe it's time we explored other options. There it was. The threat she'd made during our phone conversation, now delivered in front of witnesses. The implication was clear. If I wouldn't surrender my autonomy willingly, they were prepared to take it by force through legal proceedings. What other options? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Jonathan cleared his throat and assumed his most professional demeanor. Dorothy, in my practice, I sometimes encounter situations where family members are genuinely unable to recognize their own declining capabilities. When that happens, Illinois law provides procedures for protecting vulnerable adults through court-supervised guardianship. Guardianship. The word hit me like a physical blow. They were threatening to have me declared legally incompetent and placed under court-ordered supervision, stripping away every vestige of my independence and autonomy. You're talking about having me declared mentally incompetent? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We prefer to think of it as establishing legal protections for someone we love. But that words couldn't disguise the brutality of what they were contemplating. Jonathan says the process is actually quite straightforward when there's clear evidence of diminished capacity and family consensus about the need for intervention.
Clear evidence, family consensus. They'd been building their case for months, documenting every minor confusion or moment of forgetfulness, gathering testimony from neighbors and acquaintances, creating a paper trail that would support their petition to have me legally declared incompetent. The full scope of their betrayal was breathtaking. This wasn't a sudden decision born of genuine concern. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to gain control over my life and assets. Every conversation about my health, every question about my finances, every expression of concern about my living situation had been part of a systematic effort to build evidence for this moment. How long have you been planning this? I asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. My children exchanged glances that confirmed what I'd suspected. This intervention had been in development for months, possibly longer. Mom, we've been worried about you for a long time, Christopher finally said. We kept hoping you'd recognize the problems yourself and accept help voluntarily, but tonight has made it clear that your judgment is too compromised for you to make rational decisions about your own welfare. My judgment was too compromised? They were using my refusal to sign away my rights as evidence that I lacked the mental capacity to make decisions about my own life. It was circular logic at its most vicious. Resist their control and prove you need to be controlled. I need some air, I said, standing up abruptly. This conversation is over for tonight. Mom, you can't just walk away from this, Vanessa said, her voice rising to near panic. We've all cleared our schedules. Jonathan has prepared all these documents, and we need to resolve the situation tonight. I said this conversation is over, I repeated, moving toward the living room doorway. No, it's not over, Rebecca said, her voice turning hard and cold. You don't get to dismiss us like children just because you don't like what we're telling you. She stepped between me and the doorway, blocking my exit. For the first time in my life, I felt physically intimidated by one of my own children. Rebecca was 42 years old, in excellent physical condition and 40 years younger than me. The power dynamic was suddenly very clear. I was outnumbered, cornered in my own home, by people who were prepared to use whatever means necessary to get what they wanted. Get away from that door right now, I said, my voice gaining strength as my anger overcame my fear. Or what? You'll call the police and tell them what? That your loving children are trying to protect you from your own poor judgment? Do you think anyone is going to take your side against 3 successful adults who are clearly acting out of genuine concern for your welfare? The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Even if I called for help, who would believe that this well-dressed, articulate family was abusing a 70-year-old woman? They'd present themselves as caring children, dealing with a difficult, possibly delusional elderly parent, and their professional credentials and apparent respectability would lend credibility to their narrative. I was trapped in my own home by my own children, and they knew it. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs. "Grandma, don't sign anything tonight." Marcus appeared at the bottom of the staircase, his young face set with determination that made him look remarkably like his grandfather Theodore. He'd obviously been listening to our conversation and had decided it was time to intervene. The reaction from my children was immediate and telling. They looked genuinely shocked to see him, as if his presence somehow complicated their carefully laid plans. "Marcus, this is a private family discussion," Vanessa said sharply. "You need to go back upstairs. I am family, and Grandma obviously needs someone here who's actually looking out for her interests." Jonathan stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with this unexpected development. "Young man, these are complex legal and financial matters that adults need to resolve. You don't understand the full situation." Marcus turned to face Jonathan with a maturity that belied his 19 years. "I understand that you're pressuring my grandmother to sign documents that would give you control over her life and property. I understand that you're threatening to have her declared incompetent if she refuses to cooperate, and I understand that none of you seem to care what she actually wants." The accuracy of his assessment seemed to startle them.
"Marcus, you don't understand," Rebecca said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone. "We're trying to protect your grandmother. She's not thinking clearly about these decisions." "She's thinking perfectly clearly," Marcus shot back. "She's smart enough to know that signing those documents would be a terrible mistake, and she's brave enough to resist pressure from people who should be supporting her independence instead of trying to destroy it." Christopher stood up, clearly trying to assert adult authority over his teenage nephew. "Marcus, this is between your grandmother and her children. You need to stay out of it." "No, Uncle Christopher, I don't need to stay out of it. Someone needs to be on Grandma's side in this room, and apparently that someone is me." Marcus moved to stand beside me, creating a physical barrier between me and Rebecca, who was still blocking the doorway. His presence gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. "Marcus is right," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I am thinking clearly. I do understand these documents, and I absolutely will not sign them tonight or any other night. And if you proceed with your threats to have me declared incompetent, I'll fight you with every resource I have." The silence that followed was charged with tension and barely contained fury. My children had expected this evening to end with my signature on their documents and my capitulation to their control. Instead, they faced unified resistance from 2 generations of family members who refused to be intimidated. "This is ridiculous," Vanessa said, finally. "We're your children. We love you. We're trying to help you. Why can't you see that?" "Because it's not true. If you loved me, you'd respect my autonomy and my right to make my own decisions. If you were trying to help me, you'd support my independence instead of systematically undermining it. What you're doing isn't love. It's control disguised as concern." Jonathan began gathering his documents with sharp, angry movements. "Dorothy, this is a mistake you'll regret. These protections we're offering won't be available indefinitely, and when you need them, and you will need them, it may be too late to implement them properly." "That sounds suspiciously like another threat," Marcus observed coolly. "Are you saying that if Grandma doesn't sign these documents tonight, you'll make sure she can't get legal help when she does need it?" Jonathan's face flushed red.
I'm saying that legal planning becomes much more complicated when someone's mental capacity is in question. Courts are reluctant to validate documents signed by people whose competency is questionable. The implication was chilling. They were suggesting that by resisting their pressure tonight, I was somehow proving my incompetence, and that this resistance would make it impossible for me to get independent legal help in the future. "Get out," I said quietly. "All of you. Get out of my house." "Mom, you're making a terrible mistake," Christopher said, but he was already moving toward the door. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. That's what independence means. The right to make your own decisions, even if other people think they're wrong." Rebecca was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway to deliver one final threat. "Mom, this isn't over. We can't stand by and watch you hurt yourself through stubborn pride. If you won't accept help voluntarily, we'll explore other options. Then I guess I'll see you in court." After they left, Marcus and I stood in my living room, surrounded by the debris of our shattered family relationships. The coffee table was scattered with Jonathan's rejected documents, and the air still felt heavy with the tension of the confrontation. "Are you okay, Grandma?" he asked gently. I looked at this young man who had risked family relationships to stand by me, who had seen through manipulation that I'd been too trusting to recognize, who had given me the strength to resist pressure that might have overwhelmed me alone. "I am now," I said. "Marcus, thank you. If you hadn't been here tonight, they would have pressured you into signing those documents. And once you signed them, getting your independence back would have been almost impossible." Over the next several weeks, I followed Marcus's advice and consulted with an independent attorney who specialized in elder law. She confirmed that the documents my children had prepared would have given them broad authority over every aspect of my life, with minimal oversight and few safeguards against abuse. More disturbingly, she found several provisions that seemed designed to benefit my children financially, rather than protect my interests. The revised will included changes to beneficiary designations that would have reduced Marcus's inheritance in favor of my other children, and the trust arrangements included management fees that would have generated ongoing income for Jonathan's law practice. I never heard from my children again, except through their attorney. They did file a petition for guardianship, claiming I was mentally incompetent and unable to care for myself. But with Marcus's support and testimony from my doctors, neighbors, and friends, the court quickly dismissed their petition as unfounded and potentially motivated by financial self-interest. 6 months later, I'm still living independently in my beloved home on Elmwood Drive. I've updated my will with the independent attorney, established clear healthcare directives, and created financial safeguards that protect my assets while preserving my autonomy. The relationship with my children is permanently damaged, and that breaks my heart. But I've learned that love without respect isn't really love at all. It's control disguised as affection. And I'd rather live independently with a broken heart than surrender my dignity to people who see me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished.
Marcus visits every weekend, and he's brought friends who treat me like the sharp, capable woman I am, rather than the declining invalid my children wanted me to believe I was becoming. Through him, I've discovered that my real family consists of people who value my independence rather than threaten it, who support my choices rather than undermine them, who see my age as a source of wisdom rather than evidence of incapacity. I'm 70 years old, and I'm finally free. To everyone watching this story, remember, when someone tries to pressure you into signing legal documents for your own good, trust your instincts. When family members start questioning your judgment and competence without evidence, pay attention to their motives. And when someone who truly loves you whispers, "Don't sign anything tonight," listen to them. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones you need protection from. And sometimes a 19-year-old grandson understands love better than the adults who raised him.
What would you do in my situation? Have you ever faced family members who confused control with care? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one, and your stories help me know I'm not alone in this experience. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. And remember, it's never too late to stand up for your right to live life on your own terms.